Chapter 23, Nutrition, Body Composition, and how it relates to performance. All right, so let's look at carbohydrates and performance. So looking at intense and extended exercise, and specifically we're looking at maybe longer duration exercises, things that are lasting a little bit more than an hour in length. So that type of exercise is going to deplete glycogen, the stored form of glucose within our bodies, either from the muscles or from the liver. We only have a finite amount of it stored within our bodies, roughly on average around 2,500 kcals worth. And what a lot of research has found is obviously the time to exhaustion is going to correlate very highly with how much glycogen you had stored at the beginning of the exercise. And the diet can be a factor in how much glycogen you're storing, obviously, because we're going to be bringing in glucose. We're going to be storing it. We can also convert some things to glucose and store that as glycogen. So altering the diet slightly can alter the amount of glycogen that you have in your bodies at the start of the exercise. But again, this doesn't necessarily affect too much exercise that is lasting less than 1 hour. There could be a slight effect, but we're really talking about exercises that are lasting at least 60 minutes in length. And you can see with the figure down here, we're talking an hour or 3 hours and possibly 4 and 5 hours in length. So endurance performance can also be altered with the proper diet. And that's essentially what this figure is looking at here. There was some studies done that looked at the differences between maybe a mixed diet, a diet of protein and fats, and a diet of carbohydrates. Now, the mixed diet really didn't affect much, up until about 60 minutes of exercise. It wasn't really much of an effect until about 60 minutes. And the main point of this figure is to show that if you see these green dots, those are representative of the higher carbohydrate type of diets. And what they were actually finding, and this was kind of the start of this research in how much glycogen and the diet itself affects performance in long distance events. And what they found was the ones that had a higher glycogen content and a higher amount of glucose in the diet were able to sustain that exercise for a longer period of time. And you can see at least this one was up to, pretty close to 300 minutes. So, but at the start of the exercise, there really wasn't much of a difference in terms of pace and performance. But as they continued on with the exercise and went further and further, then that's when the glycogen stores really took into effect and were able to extend that exercise without fatiguing, past an hour, 2 hours, 3, 4 hours. So let's look at a couple ways that individuals might want to basically store up as much carbohydrates and glycogen as possible within the bodies before the exercise begins. This is known as carbohydrate supercompensation. It's also referred to as glycogen loading or carb loading. Now, it isn't just a simple matter of I'm going to just eat a bunch of carbohydrates a day or two before the competition. There's actually a method to this. And there's two ways of going about it. There's the classical method, where you have a prolonged exercise that actually depletes the glycogen stores. And when you deplete the glycogen stores, you're basically on a high-fat protein diet for at least 3 days while you're training. You're trying to deplete your glycogen stores. And you have 90% carbohydrates for 3 inactive rest days prior to the competition. And this will build back up the carbohydrate or the glycogen stores that were in the body that you just lost. So you're really breaking everything down. You're trying to get rid of as much as possible, and then you're going to build it right back up. Now, there's the modified method as well, The workouts are going to be reduced from 90 to about 40 minutes over many days. And you're going to consume about 50% carbohydrates. Then you're going to have 20-minute workouts for 2 days where you're consuming approximately 70% carbohydrates. And then you're going to have a resting day prior to the competition where you're consuming about 70% carbohydrates. So again, kind of the same concept. You've reduced the amount of carbohydrates you're ingesting and trying to lose some of them and deplete the glycogen stores somewhat. But at the same time, you're still ingesting some carbohydrates to give you that energy to continuously train throughout the time where you're not having to have 3 complete inactive days of rest. And then you're going to build back up those stores by consuming a little bit more carbohydrates then with the 2 days with the 20-minute workouts as well as the resting day. All right, so let's look at the methods here and the modification of classic glycogen loading technique. So we have the exercise time again. We're starting off at about 90 minutes, and we're going to work our way down to approximately 20 minutes. And we're just going to reduce our glycogen or our carbohydrate intake with this. So again, the exercise time is slowly decreasing, but we're going to modify the amount of carbohydrates that we are ingesting with this. Now again, with the classical method, we're going to try to deplete glycogen. And then we're going to have basically three rest days, and then we're going to consume a very high amount of carbohydrates with that. But with the modified method, we just have a tapered exercise that's going to help deplete the glycogen instead of essentially starving the body of glucose. So either way is going to basically have the same outcome, as you can see with the glycogen that is now present within the body. But some athletes have found that the modified is a little bit better because, again, you can still train and you don't feel as tired and lethargic as you would if you completely diminished your glycogen stores, as well as being on essentially a very, very low carbohydrate diet. All right, muscle glycogen itself. It is replenished usually within 24 hours as long as the diet is proper and you're getting enough of it in. Normally, it's going to be based on your kcals that are being brought in. As long as you have a good amount of carbohydrates in your diet, you're going to replenish it. So you need approximately 500 to 700 grams, depending on your caloric intake. It's also going to depend on your body size and how much storage capacity you possibly have. So approximately 50 to 65% of your diet, again, should come from carbohydrates. We've seen that in the nutrition chapter. Now, the timing of it, you should get something within you immediately. The muscles are kind of primed right after exercise. The blood vessels are vasodilated. You've kind of broken down some of the tissue, and there's going to be some enzymes and some hormones that are going to be capable of bringing in nutrients, specifically in this case, glycogen or glucose, to be able to help replenish the cells. So the muscle cell permeability is going to be increased. Also, glycogen synthase to help build up the glycogen. It's going to be increased after exercise. Also, the insulin sensitivity is going to be increased due to exercise. So it's going to be much easier to get the glucose inside of the cell because insulin is the main transporter there, main hormone to allow glucose to be transported into the cell. And then approximately every couple hours after exercise, up to about 6 hours, you really need to take advantage of all of these capabilities of bringing in the glucose into the cell. So you don't want to wait a long time after exercise to start to try to replenish your glycogen stores. You want to try to do it immediately, get something in you right after exercise. All right. A lot of times referred to as a recovery drink, recovery drink or recovery meal, something with a good amount of glucose in it. And as we'll see here, also protein is beneficial as well. All right, so looking at carbohydrate intake prior to exercise. So there's going to be a faster rate of muscle glycogen utilization during exercise. Now, just because you brought in some carbohydrates prior to exercise doesn't necessarily mean you're going to spare that glycogen. So it's not like the body can say, oh, we have something fresh, we're going to spare the stores that we have. And we'll see here in a figure that we're going to use the same amount of glycogen regardless of what we bring in. So there's going to be a fall in blood glucose. There's going to be a decrease in the glucose traveling around in the blood during exercise. And performance is going to be affected from this. And it's going to occur with or without ingestion of carbohydrates. And how much this affects someone or how much it falls is going to be dependent on each individual and whether they have some insulin sensitivity issues or not as well. All right, so carbohydrate ingestion to maintain blood glucose. All right, so this portion right here shows that when fasting or fed with carbohydrates, the muscle glycogen is going to be used up anyway. Right? It doesn't matter whether you are ingesting carbohydrates or not, you're going to use up the muscle glycogen. If you look at the blood glucose, when you are fasted, approximately 70% VO2 max is going to be when this is going to start to really drop off significantly. And that's going to cause fatiguing, right? Pretty rapidly. As soon as your blood glucose starts to go down, you can't get much more glucose into the cell. So therefore you're going to have to decrease your intensity and allow for more fats to be broken down because you can't break down glucose because there's no glucose in the blood. Now, when you're feeding and when you're ingesting something during the exercise, you can prolong that period to where you can delay fatigue significantly and you can kind of basically keep on going. All right. So you can continuously feed the system especially once you've run out or getting significantly low on muscle glycogen. If you start to feed the system and eat something, could be a drink, could maybe even be a candy bar, something with sugar in it. You're going to mitigate this drop in the blood glucose because you're going to be adding more glucose to the blood. So again, feeding during exercise. And if you see the time down here, again, exercise is 1 hour, not going to be much of an effect there. We're talking exercises 2, 3, 4 hours in length in this case. So that's why in marathons, usually there's stations not only for water and rehydration, but also replenishment and getting some type of glucose in you so you can continue the exercise without fatiguing. Let's look at protein requirement and exercise. So we have this concept of nitrogen balance. And this balance can either be positive, can be just normal, or it could be negative. So a positive nitrogen balance means that we're bringing in more nitrogen, more protein into the system than we're breaking down and getting rid of. A normal one would be there's a balance there. We're getting rid of and breaking down just as much as we're bringing in. And for a negative, we are breaking down tissue and we're getting rid of it and excreting it at a more rapid pace than we're actually ingesting it. So this negative balance can cause a loss in muscle mass. And as we'll see, this is going to be a natural response to training, especially early on. Now, how we determine what the nitrogen balance is, there's a few different ways. They're not 100% accurate, but the best ways is to be able to measure the nitrogen that is excreted in the urine as well as the sweat. Now, for amino acid oxidation, this may be related to protein energy usage, and because there's certain amino acids that are going to be able to be used for energy sources, such as alanine. All right, that's one of the amino acids that you can put into the citric acid cycle. You can break it down and go from there. Takes a little bit longer. It's not preferred, but it can be used for an energy source. Also, another amino acid, leucine, is seen as an indicator for oxidation and also the formation of alanine. And this all increases during exercise. So we're breaking down muscle tissue, and we're using a little bit of it maybe for energy as well, especially if we're glycogen depleted or if we're in maybe a starvation state. Now, looking at whole body nitrogen balance, again, we can determine this a couple different ways from the sweat and measuring the nitrogen that is excreted in the urine as well. But we can see the differences when someone is training versus not training, or maybe is getting accustomed to the training. The body is now adapting to that training. So the quality and also the quantity of the protein is going to make a huge difference here. And sometimes it has to do with the caloric balance, input versus output, how much muscle tissue we're breaking down, the intensity of the exercise, how long the exercise is taking place, and also what types of exercises. If you're doing very light weight bearing exercises, or maybe just maybe light walking, might not be that much of a difference. You're not going to see much of an impact on nitrogen balance. A little bit, it'll probably still decrease slightly within the first few days. But if you're doing really heavy weight training or really long distance type running events, then you will have a significant decrease in nitrogen balance. So that nitrogen balance will be in a negative state. Also, your glycogen stores are going to play a big role in this as well. All right, so if we look at the figure down here, we look at before exercise in the left side of the figure. You can see the nitrogen balance is positive. It's hovering around a normal or balanced nitrogen. But once they started the exercise, it went down significantly. And then it gradually went back up, and approximately a week and a half, 2 weeks later, it got back to a balanced nitrogen balance, basically. So there was no positive or negative. Now it's going to fluctuate slightly. And again, that's going to be dependent on the duration, the intensity, the activity, as well as the diet itself, how many calories you're bringing in and how much tissue that you're breaking down. So this will be a natural response. And that's why it's important to bring in good quality protein and a good amount of it, as well as keeping up with the glycogen and fats as well. It doesn't mean you have to bring in a huge amount of protein to your diet, but just keeping it, around, anywhere from 1 to 1.5 grams per kilogram of body weight. And this will help replenish the nitrogen that is being lost. And that is going to be indicative of increasing musculature and strengthening the muscles with that, because that's where the nitrogen is coming from, is from the breakdown of the muscle tissue. Now, also, more carbohydrates help to decrease amino acid oxidation, at least in terms of using it for fuel. All right, so in some experimental treatments, you have carbohydrate loaded, and you have sweat urea. So as the carbohydrate increased, and that would be indicative of carbohydrate loading, the amount of nitrogen that was lost in the urine was decreased. And someone who was depleted had a significantly higher amount of urinary nitrogen. So carbohydrates do help to decrease or mitigate the amount of muscle tissue that's broken down and used for energy. Now, there's still going to be some that's broken down, as you can see from the carb loading, but not nearly as much is going to be used for actual oxidation and used for energy. And carbohydrates are a preferred fuel of the body. They're going to be more efficient, and they're going to help you to continue the exercise longer versus protein, which may be a little bit slower. Now, if we look at this figure, We can see at the start of this exercise, we're exercising at 50% VO2 max. The labeled CO2 production is marked on the y-axis, and that can be a good indicator of leucine oxidation, one of the amino acids that can be broken down and oxidized. And you can see the level of the labeled CO2 production is increased significantly, indicating a high amount of leucine oxidation in this case. Now, when somebody ingested glucose, it starts to decrease, and then they ingested some more glucose later on in the exercise, and it decreased even further. So again, this glucose ingestion helped to mitigate the amount of leucine oxidation, and thus the amount of urea and nitrogen that is now going to be excreted. So again, another figure showing how glucose ingestion can help try to eliminate the amount of protein that is being broken down. Now, we've seen this in chapter 18. Let's go a little bit more into detail about the protein requirements for athletes. The RDA for protein is about 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight. On average, about 12 kcals, 12% of your caloric intake should be from protein. Now, endurance athletes, for light to moderate type of intensity, about 0.8 is going to be fine, 0.8 to maybe 0.1. 1.2 to 1.4 grams per kilogram for higher intensity exercises. And again, a lot of the endurance athletes are going to be focusing a lot on either fats or carbohydrates, specifically carbohydrates, to help keep them going longer in the activity. But they do need protein in their diet. Now, strength training, you would think would be a little bit higher because you're breaking down a lot of muscle tissue and you're trying to build a lot of muscle tissue. But it's really not that much higher, 1.2 to 1.7. If you go over 2.0, there's not much of an increase in muscle size because of that increased ingestion. So for hypertrophy, again, 1.2 to 1.7 should be sufficient. And even if you get maybe a little bit less than that 1.0, that's still going to be pretty good. Now, the average athlete, you're looking at about 16% of your caloric intake is coming from protein, or at least should come from protein, and about 1.5 grams per kilogram. All right. So if you just say 1.5 grams per kilogram, you should be fine with that. That should be sufficient. Now, someone who is a vegetarian needs to plan their diets accordingly because of the essential amino acids that are needed in the body. All right. So different plants, different sources are going to have different amino acids. Complete protein would come from actual meat products, chicken, beef, fish, eggs, but vegetarians are going to have a little bit more difficulty with it. But if someone is a vegetarian, they probably know that, and they're probably planning their diets accordingly, especially athletes who tend to be vegetarians as well. Now, the timing of the protein. So this is actually in the box, in the table 23.1, the winning edge. So looking at the different sources of protein, protein synthesis is going to increase after the workout. There's going to be some hormones that are released, testosterone as well as growth hormone, human growth hormone, to help increase protein building, essentially building the tissues back up. We're also going to be getting rid of some of the debris and some of the stuff that has been broken down, but we're also trying to rebuild that muscle immediately. And it's also increased a little bit further with amino acid consumption. So getting protein after the workout and getting the right amount of it and the right kind of it is going to be important. So some of the sources we have, if you look at milk, it has whey and casein protein. Whey protein is going to be about 1/5 of the milk product. It's going to digest a little bit more rapidly. Casein protein is most of what milk is made up of. Now, it's going to sustain essential amino acids longer. All right. So, and it's going to contain some more essential amino acids. And that's why milk tends to be a good kind of recovery drink, and especially chocolate milk. Chocolate milk tends to have a good amount of sugar to protein ratio. I believe the ratio is around 4-to-1 or so of carbohydrates versus protein. And it also has some good protein. It also has good vitamins and minerals in it to be sufficient for a recovery or replacement drink if you cannot get a actual meal. Now, the reason for the protein plus the carbohydrates and why that is good is not only do you get the carbohydrates to try to replenish the glycogen stores, and you get the protein to try to rebuild and start to jumpstart that protein synthesis, but also with the carbohydrates, you're going to be increasing the release of insulin. And that insulin response helps to not only transport glucose into the cell, but also helps to transport protein and amino acids into the cell. So it's a win-win both ways. So milk can be used as a recovery drink. Again, specifically chocolate milk is really good for that as well. Let's look at fluid replacement before exercise. Now let's see this figure over here on the left. So I've described this before, and we have basically a depiction of heart rate in the red, cardiac output in the blue. We got blood volume here in the green, mean arterial pressure in the purple, and then in yellow is stroke volume. Now the ones we want to, focus on, well, if we're exercising, it doesn't matter whether it's in the heat or wherever it is. If we're not replenishing our water stores or water within the body floating around in the blood, we're going to be sweating it off regardless. So we're going to be losing it. So the blood volume is going to be decreasing. Right. The mean arterial pressure is also going to be decreasing. And that's kind of indicative of the blood volume itself decreasing, right? Because there's less blood being pushed against the sides of the arteries. Now, with this decrease in blood volume, we have less blood coming back to the heart, which causes this decrease in stroke volume. That decrease in stroke volume may or may not affect cardiac output. The other part of cardiac output in the blue here, you can see it maintains relatively equal. It doesn't really change all that much. And that's good because we want to try to maintain cardiac output, because if we don't, we've basically got to a point in the exercise where we need a specific amount of blood to fuel the muscles. And we want to maintain that volume. And that's what the cardiac output shows. To maintain the cardiac output, if the stroke volume has decreased, we need to increase the heart rate. And that's exactly what happens here. The heart rate gradually increases and keeps on increasing as we continuously lose more and more blood volume. This is known as cardiovascular drift. All right, so the heart rate is increasing to help maintain the cardiac output due to a decrease in the stroke volume because we're losing water. So the important thing here is to not rely on your thirst sensors. It's you need to drink fairly often to try to maintain your blood volume, as well as your core temperature. The water in the sweat is going to be used to help thermoregulate your body. All right, if you look at the figures over here, these are 4 different circumstances where the athletes ingested no fluid, a small amount of fluid, a moderate amount of fluid, and a large amount of fluid. And we have 3 separate graphs looking at esophageal temperature being representative of core temperature, heart rate, as well as rating of perceived exertion, or RPE. And the exercise time in this case was approximately 2 hours in length. So as we can see, the individual who consumed no fluid, their esophageal temperature increased significantly. This is in Celsius, right? So that's a significant amount. You look at 38.6 versus the individual who drank a large amount of fluid, 37.8. All right, so that's almost a whole degree Celsius, which is fairly significant when you're looking at body temperature. And the same thing with heart rate. The individual who drank no fluids had a much higher heart rate versus the individual who drank a large amount of fluid. And the same thing with rating of perceived exertion. They felt like they were working much harder during the exercise, especially during the end of the exercise, than the individuals who actually drank water. So not only does water make you feel like the lack of water make you feel like you're working harder than what you normally would, but it also has a physiological effect on temperature, thermoregulation, as well as cardiovascular basically function, right? Increasing the heart rate more and more. And it goes back to this cardiovascular drift. In this case, this person in the blue or the teal was decreasing their blood volume because they were sweating a large amount. They were decreasing their stroke volume. And the only way to maintain the cardiac output at that point was to increase the heart rate. And that is exactly what happened in this case. And you can even see it in the person who drank just a small amount of fluid versus the moderate or large amounts of fluid. So hydration is very, very important. All right, so the fluid replacement during exercise and the recommendations. The temperature should be approximately 15 to 21 degrees Celsius. There used to be a myth saying that to make the drink feel better, I guess for the individual and for absorption and to help decrease core temperature, the water needs to be warm. That's not the case. And in fact, even some recent studies that have been published show that cold water and even slushies are much better at reducing core temperature. You have this heat sink that's happening when you ingest something cold. That's why it feels better to eat some ice cream versus something really warm during the summertime. So, and there could also be a psychological effect with that. But water temperature, if it's a cool water temperature, it doesn't necessarily need to be 100% ice cold, but a cooler temperature nonetheless. Also, sodium and potassium are going to help with replenishment as well. You're going to be losing sodium as well as potassium through the sweat. So you need some electrolytes along with that. And that's why Gatorade is so popular and is important. And a lot of athletes use Gatorade to help replenish themselves during an activity. Really, if they're sweating a lot, because they're losing a lot of electrolytes in that case. So 5 to 10% of it should come from carbohydrates. For high intensity exercises, greater than 70% VO2 max in this case, and also low to moderate intensity exercises, there's really no difference in gastric emptying. And gastric emptying is just the how quick that food or that drink moves out of the stomach and into the small intestine. The faster that gastric emptying is, the better, because there's not a lot of water that's actually absorbed within the stomach. So we need to get that moving. All right. So we need to get it into the small intestine so we can absorb the water. The more and more carbohydrate content that there is, the slower that gastric emptying is. So it can't be very high of a concentration. Also, drinking more and more fluids is going to help increase the gastric emptying. All right. And fluids, I'm talking about just water itself. If you increase the volume of that ingestion, that will help to increase gastric emptying. And again, you need to watch this 5 to 10% because around 8%, you're going to start to slow gastric emptying, and just what I was talking about a second ago. Now, after exercise, for every 1 kilogram of weight loss, ingestion of approximately 1.5 liters. All right. Now, it doesn't need to be chugging an entire liter or liter and a half, but at least getting it in at some point, at least within 24 hours post-exercise. And again, I talked about the milk and carbohydrates for a replenishment drink. So not only the carbohydrates, but also you have electrolytes in there as well, and also some protein for for rebuilding the muscle tissue. Now, looking at salt and sodium specifically here, we have athletes versus sedentary, or you can also name this acclimated versus unacclimated individuals. Someone who is acclimated to a hot environment versus someone who is not acclimated. So there's going to be greater sweat losses, and water is going to follow sodium for untrained individuals or someone who is unacclimated to a hot environment. And there's going to be decreased sweat rates and also sodium loss when somebody is trained. Now, overall, you might increase the amount of sweating that does go on once you become trained, but the rate's going to be a little bit lower, and it's going to be more dilute, so you're not losing as much electrolytes in that sweat. Now, with dehydration, you have obviously some heat illness risks. Not only heat cramps, but heat exhaustion and heat stroke along with that. So again, replenishing water as you need it, right? And even before you become thirsty. Most individuals do consume adequate amounts. Some do not. Some it's by choice. Some just might not feel thirsty. Sometimes it could be a sport where maybe the coach is not allowing the athletes to drink a proper amount of fluids. They say, oh, you need to earn your water. You know, that was kind of the old school way. But now we know, because of after certain incidents where people have become very ill or even died, we know that we need to make sure that athletes are getting the proper hydration throughout the exercise, specifically in hot climates. So there's also increased intake during meals. For salt, I mean, salt is obviously a big part of our meals, and we talked about that in chapter 18 with the American diet. We do have a lot of salt, so normally we don't get a whole lot of deficiencies. So it does need to match the fluid and sodium intake versus the loss. So you don't necessarily need to ingest to catch up, right? So you just need to just match the amount of losses that we have. Now, looking at minerals. So iron is going to be very important for oxygen transportation. It is part of the heme portion of the hemoglobin. It's the most common nutritional deficiency, or at very least, it is one of the most common. It's going to be more common amongst females because they tend to have, because of certain instances of the menses, the menstrual cycle, as well as hormonal problems. And also they may have some eating disorders that can go along with that. This is the female triad stuff. But also they tend to stay away from meat products that have a good amount of iron in them. Now, with any type of deficiency in iron, you're going to have endurance and performance issues. A decrease in VO2 max, that oxygen carrying capacity is going to be diminished, as well as the iron is important for the electron transport chain intermediate. So we're going to have some problems just with actually going through the electron transport chain itself. So some of the causes of deficiency, there could be blood loss in the GI tract, could possibly be an issue. Red blood cell damage, that's just naturally going to occur. And it's also going to occur, we're going to start bursting some red blood cells and breaking them down if we're running on hard surfaces. Some of those get crushed within the knee joints and even the ankles a little bit as well. And hemoglobin can be lost in urine or sweat. And again, menstruation is going to be another cause of loss of iron in red blood cells. Now, if we look at the recovery, somebody who was deficient, we have a VO2 max, and we have a dietary iron supplementation or repletion going on. And basically within 7 days, the individual is almost back up to 100% of all of these, VO2 max, hematocrit, muscle pyruvate oxidase, as well as the endurance capabilities. So it doesn't take too long to get back to normal, but someone who is deficient, they need to be aware of it, and they need to take the proper steps to replenish their bodies of the iron. All right, vitamins. Just one quick little slide on this. You can read some of the details about all the different vitamins, but in general, we're going to look at how they affect energy production. A lot of times they're part of coenzymes or cofactors in aerobic metabolism. And some of them are even involved specifically with the citric acid cycle. If you refer back to biochemistry, you see that FAD and NADH help to transport electrons into the electron transport chain. The F and the N in FAD and NAD are B vitamins. All right, so those are directly related to aerobic metabolism. And again, a lot of these are also cofactors or coenzymes for a lot of the reactions that occur in aerobic metabolism. So you could say that, if you have more of them, if you have the right amount, that's going to be good. Everything's going to be working properly. But if you have more, or if you're exercising more, you're going to be depleted more of these, and you need some type of supplementation. Or if you want to get more of it, more is better. But that's not necessarily true. They're usually unnecessary unless there is some type of deficiency, severe deficiency. Normally a well-balanced diet, fruits, vegetables, whole grains, fiber, all this stuff, you're getting the right amount of foods, the right quantity and quality of foods. You shouldn't be deficient unless there's something going on, either a health condition, or you're not eating maybe a certain food that has a high amount of a certain vitamin. Or such as in the case of vitamin D, you might not be drinking milk, and you might not be going outside. You could be wearing sunscreen all the time, so you're not exposed to the UV rays that help convert the enzyme to vitamin D. So there could be instances with that. But as long as you're having a well-balanced diet, there shouldn't be any problem, and you shouldn't necessarily need supplementation. Now, there could be some supplementation that is needed during pregnancy. But again, we're talking about athletes, just normal athletes who are not pregnant and are relatively healthy. Now, there could be, again, improved performance if somebody is deficient, and then they bring the levels back up to where they were because of the supplementation. All right, that was Chapter 23, Nutrition, Body Composition, and Performance. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments, or you can email me. And if you want to like the video, go ahead and like it. So I thank you for watching.